Grant, welcome to the show. How are you today?
Mike, doing well, man. Thanks for letting me hang out with you, brother.
Yeah, super happy to have you. Great topic on speaking, and we have you as a huge expert in this topic. So really happy to get into that. Also, kind of digging into you and your backstory. Really interesting in terms of how you sort of made this decision and transition from what you were doing. And so I'd like to really start there for our audience. Can you kind of just give us a little bit of background in terms of where you started your career, or what you were kind of doing, maybe college-ish, and how you kind of got into the world of teaching people how to speak?
Yeah, for sure. So back in high school, I was really involved in my local church, and my youth pastor had a really big impact in my life. And I was like, I want to do that. Like, that seems like a really cool, rewarding career. And just kind of felt like if I could make the kind of impact on other people that he made on me, like that just seems, incredibly rewarding. And so that was kind of the track I was on. I went to Bible college. I was a youth pastor at a different local church for a little while. And as a youth pastor, there are things I liked, things I didn't like. But one of the things I really enjoyed and I felt like I was decent at was speaking. Each week I was speaking to students multiple times. Every so often I'd get to speak on the weekends in big church, quote unquote. And I just really enjoyed it. And so it was one of those things that I wanted to do more of. But at the time, this was, 17, 18 years ago or so, there just wasn't a lot of resources out there in terms of like, how do you find speaking gigs, and how much do you charge, and who hires speakers, and what do you speak about? And like, how does this mysterious black box work? And so at the time, because there wasn't a lot of resources out there, I found myself just stalking other speakers, just emailing other speakers, just pestering them with questions, just trying to learn anything. And I felt like I had the potential, but I needed the plan. I had the potential, but I needed the plan. And so I learned a couple of things, and eventually started booking some gigs here and there, and got to a point where over the next couple of years, I was doing, 20, 30 gigs and 30, 40 gigs and 50, 60 gigs, and got to a point where I was doing about 60 or 70 gigs a year, and loved it. It was awesome. And at the same time, I had a lot of people who were asking me like, hey man, I want to do that too. I want to be a speaker. How would I go about doing that? And so I started doing some coaching, teaching, training around that, and then started leaning more into that. And that's evolved into what I do today. So I run a training company for speakers and teaching people how to find and book paid speaking gigs called the Speaker Lab. And so that's our entire world now.
So a couple of follow-ups. You said you thought you had probably some skills or some ability in terms of speaking. And that you really wanted to help people. You had this need to kind of help people, and were very influenced by your pastor. Would you say that the pursuit of speaking as kind of a profession was mainly driven by like the skill, and understanding that you had the skill, or did you really see speaking and to audiences as kind of the best way, the biggest platform to sort of influence people?
Yeah, good question. So even in college, I actually worked for a guy who was a full-time speaker. And so I kind of got to see a little bit behind the scenes of like, what does that look like? And I kind of helped him with like travel and logistics and contracts and a little bit of sales and like that sort of thing. And so they gave me at least a little bit of sense of, what does it look like behind the curtain? What does it look like to run a speaking business? Because being a speaker, like there people see like the glamorous side of that, of standing on stage or meeting people or signing autographs or taking pictures or whatever it may be. But like, there's a lot of like, it's running a business. And so it's a big thing that we teach today within the Speaker Lab. And so that kind of gave me a little bit of a sneak peek behind there. And so speaking was just one of those things I just really enjoyed. I felt like I was decent at whenever I would speak. I was like, I think I had like enough self-awareness to realize there's something there. I knew that I wasn't a disaster at it, but I knew I wasn't the best at it, and I knew I could get better. And so I think that, I reaching out to and connecting with some other speakers just also helped me to see like what the possibilities were. And I think that's great career advice for anybody. And this is something I still talk with speakers about today, is to look for people who are a step or two ahead of you, not light years ahead of you, but a step or two ahead of you, who are doing something similar to what you want to do and doing it in a way that you want to do it. Because for me, that helps connect the dots of like, okay, this is possible, or this is what that could look like. And I could see myself doing that. And so it kind of helped me to just kind of crystallize in my mind, because the idea of like when someone hears, I want to be a speaker, it's like, Yeah, but what does that mean? Like that means that 100 different things to 100 different people. And so what does that actually look like? And so for me, as a former youth pastor, I was interested in speaking to students. I was interested in speaking to high schools, colleges. And so meeting with some people who were doing that and doing, 40, 50, 60, 70 gigs a year, speaking at the type of conferences I could see myself speaking at. Again, it kind of just gave me a roadmap and a path of like, okay, this is what this might look like. And so I think another thing, especially since we're talking about like from a career angle, is when I left that role as a youth pastor, like that was a really, really, really difficult transition for me mentally. Because at the time my wife was 4 or 5 months pregnant. I didn't have another job lined up. It wasn't really clear of like, okay, you're going to, leave this youth pastor gig. You're immediately going into speaking. I just knew like, okay, this youth pastor gig wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do, but I just wasn't really sure what I should be doing instead. And so literally for the next couple of months, like wife is pregnant. I worked for a security company doing like residential home security system sales, like door-to-door type stuff. I worked at night, a couple nights a week at some different restaurants as a server, doing like at a fine dining restaurant. And it was just like piecing things together, trying to make ends meet, and also kind of like licking my wounds and just figuring out like, all right, now what? And so there's kind of this I don't know, unspoken pressure of, okay, I went to college to do this one particular thing. I got into doing it, and then it wasn't necessarily what I hoped it would be. So now do I just keep doing that, or do I do something different? And so for the next several months, it was really trying to think through like, okay, what do I really want to do? What is it that I'm good at? What is it that I'm passionate about? What is it where I can make a decent living? And where is it that like all these, what's the Venn diagram of all of these different things coming together? And I would say, again, those few months there were really, really difficult and challenging, but it was incredibly, I think like those months were really, really pivotal for me getting clarity on like, this is what I want to do. And speaking was the thing that I kept coming back to, of just like, okay, I think I can do this. And I know this is not an overnight thing. And I know it's not going to just magically happen because I decide I want to speak, but I could see myself doing it. And I understood like, okay, what's the path and the steps I need to be taking to get there. And so for anybody who's watching or listening, who's in a spot going like, I'm doing something, I'm not sure I enjoy it, I'm not sure I want to keep doing it, I'm not really sure what I'd rather be doing, that's okay. Like for me, I felt like for speaking, there's no guarantee there, but I felt like I would rather try it and it be a huge disaster than to always look back on the end of my life and be like, dang, I think I could have made that work, but I'll never know because I didn't try. And so for me, it was just kind of like, okay, let's lean into speaking. Let's see what happens. Maybe it's a huge train wreck, but I don't know. And again, I think that was just a real pivotal season to really take the time to think through, what is it that I want to do versus just going with the path of least resistance or what other people expected me to do.
So much to unpack or follow up on that. It's like so well said. And it's something that I think so much of our audience struggled with. And certainly I struggled with at that period of time as well. I mean, I can just remember not knowing what I wanted to do, and not having like a great passion. Yeah, I feel like I had some skills that I could lean into probably, much like you did, right? You kind of took this skills approach. I have a knack for this, and plus I like it. And so we're going to go that way. But figuring out how to do that, it seems like college is sort of the place that should all take place, right? In terms of figuring things out. But very often it doesn't. And so, I had a conversation very recently with a guest about that whole thing in terms of like, we almost have it backwards. We're getting hired and then we're getting trained instead of like acquiring useful skills, and kind of like taking this options approach to figure out what we like and are good at and then getting hired. It's almost backwards for a lot of us, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you think back for maybe for you and I, for a lot of people who are watching or listening, you go to college in your late teens and your early 20s, and you're just like, man, you don't know, and you're making your best guess, and you can only see. I've heard the illustration that life is very much like driving a car at night. You can only see a few feet ahead of you, but you can make the whole journey that way. I mean, you can literally drive for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, only ever seeing a few feet in front of you. And you don't know the construction that's up ahead, or the roadblock, or the detour, or the tree that fell over the road, or the potential car wreck that you had to swerve and miss, or, you don't know any of that stuff, when you're in your late teens and early 20s. And our oldest daughter, She is 16. And so, we're starting to talk about college stuff. And it's also like, I think for us now, it's not putting the pressure on, hey, you need to know, you need to know, you need to know. Cause like, there's a good chance whatever you go to college for, or even whether or not you go to college, and that's a totally different discussion,
Right.
is that there's a good chance you're going to do a variety of different things throughout the course of your career. It's more and more unusual for someone to do one thing for their entire career. Like most people just have a wide variety of different interests and opportunities. I mean, we're recording this in mid 2022, and who knows what the opportunities are that are going to exist in the next 1, 5, 10, 20 years from now, that may be like, that's not even on the menu right now of options or opportunities. But when it is presented, it's like, dang, that seems really cool. I think I'd really like that. It's just not a thing right now. And so I think it's helpful to also take some pressure off of yourself of feeling like you need to know what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And that's the only thing. Like you're not getting married. You're not making some lifelong commitment here. Like you're picking a career path. You're picking a starting point, and that may evolve and change over time. And I think that hopefully that takes some of the pressure off.
I like the driving at night analogy. I hadn't heard that before, but it's a pretty good one. The one that I've used is open water swimming. I don't know if you're familiar with swimming at all, but like when you open water swim, let's say you're swimming like a mile in a lake or something like that, you can go a few feet by having your head down and stroking, but you got to pick your head up and you got to look
the sight,
see if you're on the right line. And that's the one that I use with people and with kids. And so, when you made that choice and that decision, do you feel, I mean, you were leaning into it and you were, I think, internally feeling like this is the right, at least direction to go. Do you feel like you had to kind of cold turkey quit in order to make that leap and commit? Or do you think that you could have somehow side hustled it or, done it in a different way? And I asked that specifically because, again, we get a lot of questions around what do I do? Do I need to cold turkey quit when I'm making a change, or can I step into this kind of thing?
Well, I think a lot of it just kind of depends on the nature of what you're wanting to be doing, so there's going to be some things where like you may need to burn the boats and go all in, and some things where like, let's take, for example, speaking. So one of the things that's challenging about speaking is that when you book a gig, you may get a deposit for that gig, but you typically don't get the majority or all of the money for it until the gig actually happens. Well, most gigs are booked several months out. So I may, if we're recording this in July, I may book a gig in January. Well, that's great when January gets here, but I still got to pay a bill in July. And so I know for me, it took me about 18 months to go from 0 gigs on the calendar to making the transition to being able to go all in on speaking. And I see for most speakers, it takes, usually a year, a couple of years, because it's kind of like, it's a gradual cycle there. And so for me, what I was doing was, again, I was working the security sales job. I was working a couple different restaurants. And so as I was booking gigs, I might drop the security job, and then I book some more gigs, and I might drop a restaurant gig. And then I might book some more speaking gigs, and I might drop something, so you're kind of like piecing it together. And I think thankfully, we live in an economy where there's a lot of those type of like gig opportunities, whether that's, you're delivering groceries or Uber or whatever it may be, where you can kind of like piece together a couple things. So like when I was working at the restaurants or doing the security stuff, like none of this is like career aspirations. I'm just like buying time, like licking my wounds, again, kind of figuring out what's next there, and just also trying to like make ends meet and put food on the table. And so as the quote unquote side hustle, the speaking business continued to take off, then I was just kind of decreasing my dependence on some of these outside things, so I could focus more and more of my energy and effort on the speaking. But like when speakers now come to me and say, hey, I'm brand new, I want to quit my job on Friday and become a full-time speaker on Monday, it's like, that's not a thing. Like it just doesn't work like that. And so I would absolutely not recommend or advise doing something like that. But it is good to have some type of roadmap or some type of plan to figure out how do you get from point A to point B of where you want to be.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you were doing is essentially giving yourself breathing room, extending your runway, as we call it, through those, through piecing together some jobs. Yeah. We talk about that a lot with people, being able to freelance, being able to do side gigs, using Upwork or whatever to keep the income going and covering your expenses while you figure everything out. You don't need a total plan at point A, but you need enough runway to make some mistakes and learn. It's really that kind of like learning glide path. So we talk a lot about, freelancing and using whatever skill it is that you're getting paid for today in your job,
Mm-hmm.
trying to find one client that can pay you to do that in an hourly capacity, and then kind of talking about and modeling out your runway. Like that's sort of the key to creating a path to change. So It sounded like you were on that piecing it together with restaurant work and all that kind of stuff, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at the like in hindsight now, you're like, oh man, everything worked out. It was great. But at the time, you're like, you don't know. You're chasing a dream and you're hoping it works out. And you're just again making ends meet and going. You'd book a gig and be like, okay, maybe we're making some progress here. And again, part of the thing with speaking is it can be very cyclical, meaning that you may have a month where you do 8 gigs, and then it gets to typically things are slower around December or around summertime, and so. December, you may have none gigs, and you're just like, well, crap, now what do I do? And so you do have just kind of these ebbs and flows. And that's also part of entrepreneurship of any kind, whether you want to be a speaker or you want to open a bakery or whatever it is that you want to do. Like there's just ebbs and flows that you have to be able to kind of stomach and understand how to balance.
So I assume when you set out to become a speaker, quote unquote, I mean, you have to have some type of expertise or topic that you're speaking on. And people ask me this all the time, like, well, what should I be known for? What do I, online content creators too, right? Like, what's my topic and all that kind of stuff. How did you do that? You had obviously the background as a youth pastor, but like, how did you pick your topics? And what did that look like at the time back then?
Yeah. And this is something we talk with speakers about all the time is there's 2 key questions you have to ask is number 1, who do you speak to? And number 2, what problem do you solve for that audience? And you want to be as specific and clear as possible. So when it comes to like, who do you speak to? The default for some people is like, I just want, I don't know, man. I just want to speak to people. I want to speak to humans. My message is for everybody. And what do I speak about or what problem do I solve? I don't know. What do you want me to speak about? I can speak about anything. I can speak about family or faith or marketing or business or entrepreneurship or sales or golf or just like on and on the list goes. And even if you know something about all those things, or if you're intrigued by all those things, you can't do that. And so the illustration that we give all the time for speakers, and this is true for anybody trying to figure out their career path, is you want to be a steakhouse and not a buffet, a steakhouse and not a buffet. And what I mean by that is like, if you and I are going to get a good steak, like we have a choice. We could go to a buffet where steak is one of 100 different things that they offer and they're all mediocre. Or we could go to a steakhouse where they do one thing, but they do that one thing really, really, really well. So they don't do lasagna, they don't do pasta, they don't do seafood, they don't do tacos, they do steak. And that's it. And as a speaker, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, like that's what you want to do. You want to be a steakhouse and not a buffet. You don't want to be mediocre at a whole bunch of different things. You want to be really, really good at one thing. Let me give you another illustration. So let's imagine that, God forbid, Mike, you had to have brain surgery. Okay. You have something goes wrong with your dome. You got to have brain surgery. You have a choice. You could go to your local family medical doctor. They went to med school. They are a doctor. They've probably performed a few surgeries before. They probably know more about the brain than you or I do, but they've never done brain surgery. Or you go to a brain surgeon where day in and day out, they do one thing. Got an issue with your heart? You don't go to them. You break your leg? You don't go to them. You got COVID? You don't go to them. But if you got a brain issue, that's who you go to. And so again, they do one thing, but they do it really, really well. And so it's counterintuitive because oftentimes we think the more things we can speak about or the more skill sets that we acquire, the better the more appealing we become in the marketplace. And the reality is that the more specific, the more narrow, the more focused, the more clear you are, the easier it is to find and attract the right type of opportunities for you. And again, that's really, really difficult because by narrowing it in, you're making conscious decisions of I'm going to do this and I'm not going to focus on that. So I'll give you an example, like right now within the Speaker Lab, is people who are interested in speaking are also typically interested in writing a book or coaching or consulting or doing a course or doing a podcast or doing a online video training. And like, there's all these different things that we could get into, but we continually tell ourselves, no, we need to be a steakhouse. We need to be really, really good at doing one thing versus being a steakhouse that says, but we could also do pasta, but we could also do tacos, but we could also do salad, but we could also do then you become Cheesecake Factory that has like 1,000-page menu and is mediocre at a bunch of different things versus like, no, just make cheesecake, make cheesecake and just do that one thing really, really, really well versus trying to be all things to all people.
So what was like your first paid speaking gig? Like what was the topic?
Yeah, so I primarily, again, early on, primarily just focused on students, since that was a world I understood. I enjoyed speaking to students. I met a couple of guys that I reached out to that were youth speakers, and were doing a lot in high schools and colleges and that type of space. So my very first gig, I spoke at a leadership conference in Missouri, which is where I was living at the time. And I spoke for like 30, 45 minutes to a group of about 300 students, and they paid me $1,000. And it was just absolutely mind blowing. I vividly remember like going to speak, and I got a standing ovation afterwards, and I go talk to the event planner. They hand me this check and go to the car. I look at it, it's $1,000. I knew that's how much it was going to be. That's what we contracted for. But still, it was just like, I mean, $1,000 then was just like $1 billion. I remember just like candidly just breaking down into tears. Like, I cannot believe I just got paid $1,000 to do this. And it was just absolutely mind boggling to me. But that, again, that's part of what kind of lit the fire of like, I can do this. I can make this happen. And it's not easy, but I absolutely believe that I could do that. But I also knew, and it's the same thing we tell speakers today, like it requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of effort. And so just because you want to be a speaker, or just because you want to be an artist, or just because you want to be a podcaster, great. So does everybody else. Like, but you got to put in the reps, you got to put in the work.
So you've spoken all over the world, hundreds of thousands of people, and you could have kind of kept just doing it. I mean, you still do, obviously, but you decided at some point that there's an opportunity to help people and to teach people. And so I wanted to start talking a little bit about Speaker Lab, but was there one moment where the light bulb went on with that and you said, I can continue to do this and I enjoy it, but as part of my mission, I can really, there's an opportunity here to help teach people?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was, like, I can remember a couple specific instances. One was I got to a point where I was doing about 70 gigs a year, and that had me on the road 80, 90 nights a year. I was away from the family a lot. I'm married to my high school sweetheart. We got 3 daughters. It's me and a house full of women. It's the absolute best. I love it. And so as much as I enjoy speaking, and being on the road is not always miserable, but it's not always glamorous. I enjoy being home. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good father. Like, those things are deeply, deeply important to me. And so in order to build a business as a speaker, or to make more, like you have a choice. You can either do more gigs, which I didn't really want to do, or you needed to switch industries, because there are certain industries that you can charge more than others. You can charge more at speaking to corporations or associations than you can to high schools, right? It's not that one's better or worse, but they're each kind of different. But when you're switching industries, you're basically starting over. And so that wasn't super appealing. In addition, I remember a friend telling me one time, like, speaking is a high-paying manual labor job, in that I would get paid way too well to stand on stage and run my mouth. But the nature of it was I had to get on a plane. I had to leave my family. I had to go somewhere. And it's kind of like a brain surgeon, a brain surgeon makes a ton of money and they have a really good gig, but they got to show up and do brain surgery. So if you're sick, or if you want to take vacation, or if you, whatever, like, you're not getting paid, you're not making anything from that. And so I had a job, I didn't have a business. And so I remember, like, one really pivotal moment for me was, I was doing a lot of gigs and really enjoying it, and doing like some like high profile gigs in that industry and in that pond. And I was in Reno, Nevada for a gig, and there's a good speaker friend of mine, mentor, who was in the area. And so we met up, we went over to Lake Tahoe, we drove around. He's probably about 20 years older than me, and kind of the speaker mentor figure. And he gave me a really, he told me 2 things. He said, one, I told him I was just kind of like, I felt restless and bored. And so he told me 2 things. One was, he said, some people like want to be and will be speakers for their entire career. And like, he's a great example of that. He still speaks a ton today, and he loves it and does not want to do anything different. And he said to me, he said, Grant, I think you are a really great entrepreneur who happens to be a great speaker. And that really resonated with me. So I just kind of felt like if I stopped speaking that day, like I'd be fine. I enjoy speaking, but there's a lot of things I enjoy. And so but entrepreneurship and business is something I really, really enjoy. That's something that really lights me up. But the other thing that he said to me that I think is super, super relevant for this conversation, for everybody watching and listening, I want you to lean in, tune in, because this is important. But he said, you have to regularly find things where the challenge exceeds the skill set. where the challenge exceeds the skill set. Meaning, when I first started speaking, I felt like I was way over my head. I had no clue what I was doing. The challenge exceeded the skill set. But what happens is over time, the longer you do something, it flips and the skill set exceeds the challenge. And you become, so I could stand up on stage in front of 1,000 people and do a great job, but inside just be on autopilot and be bored because I know this joke works and I know how to tell this story. I've told it hundreds and hundreds of times and it just works and da, 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 da. And you're just kind of like, again, delivering great, but just kind of like going through the motions. And so he said, you have to regularly find things where the challenge exceeds the skill set, where you feel like you're in over your head and just enough in a healthy way. And so that was such a good piece of advice for me. And it just hit me at the right time where I felt like the skill set had exceeded the challenge, meaning like, was I the best speaker in the world? No, not at all. But like in that world, I had done a lot of the major gigs. I'd done, a lot of the big stages. And so I was just kind of like, it wasn't really intriguing to keep climbing that mountain versus finding a different mountain to climb. So for, again, everybody watching and listening, you have to regularly find things where the challenge exceeds the skill set, because that's fun. That's what's appealing. You and I, before we started recording, we were talking about golf. That's part of what makes golf so dang fun, is because the challenge always exceeds the skill set, no matter how good you get at golf. You go out there and you have the round of your life, but then the next day, like, you shoot 20 strokes different and you're just like, the challenge exceeds the skill set, and there's always something you can be working on, but the challenge is always one step ahead of where your skills are.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's that's where the growth is, right? In that kind of gap between your skill sets and the challenge. So that's phenomenal. I love that quote. So talk to us, how is Speaker Lab set up? How does it all work? Tell our audience about the business.
Yeah. So we work with people who are where I was when I got started, meaning, again, I had the potential, but I needed the plan. I was interested in speaking, but I didn't know how much do you charge and who hires speakers and what do you speak about and how does this world work? And that's where I was at. And I know that there are so many people who are in that same spot. And so you may be watching and listening right now going like, hey, I'm interested in being a speaker. And that's going to look vastly different to everybody. Meaning there's some people who are like, I want to speak 5 times a year. And some people that are like, I want to speak 50 or 100 times a year. And it's not that one's better or worse than the other. You just got to kind of decide what makes sense for you, what it is that you want to do. In addition, there's massive opportunities for virtual speaking now, thanks to the pandemic. And so, that was kind of a hesitation for me. Was early on, I want to be a speaker, but I don't want to be gone all the time. Like I don't want to do this and ruin or wreck my family. But there are massive opportunities now for virtual speaking. And so for a lot of people that we talk to and work with, there are people who, I've done some speaking, I like speaking, I want to do more of it. I just don't know where to go from here. And so those are the speakers that we work with through one-on-one and group coaching and training. We have different programs where we help them with building your website, building their demo video, and finding speaking leads specifically for them and where it is that they're at, what they're looking to do. And so we just basically, like, we're going to hold your hand, walk with you, and try to make this as dead simple of like, here's the roadmap you need to follow. We teach what we call the Speaker Success Roadmap that makes the acronym SPEAK, SPEAK. And we walk and guide speakers through that process to help them get to the end result of standing on stage, sharing their message, and making an impact and income with their speaking.
Got it. So ideal person that's going to get the most out of working with you and your team is someone who is literally trying to book speeches and gigs and create at least an income stream, if not a full-time career, out of the profession of speaking, right? Yep.
You're exactly right. And again, that's going to look different for everybody. So someone may want to do this full time and someone may want to do 5 gigs on the side. And again, we work with speakers on both ends of the spectrum. We work with speakers in every US state and in 49 different countries around the world. And speakers at all different skill levels. So some people are totally clear on, I know exactly what I want to speak about and I know exactly what problem I want to solve. And some people are like, I got a dozen different things. I got a buffet of choices here. Help me narrow it down to become a steakhouse. And one of the things that we have found is it's hard to read the label from inside the jar. It's hard to read the label from inside the jar, meaning that sometimes we're like, here's a dozen different things that I like, or I'm interested in, or I'm knowledgeable on, but I don't know, like, how does that translate to a speaking business? And which of these makes the most sense? Because just because you're passionate about a topic, or you know something about it, or you care something about it, like, it doesn't mean people book speakers to talk about that. So we have a team of coaches that work with you who are professionals in the industry to help you understand, like, what aligns with what event planners and decision makers are actually hiring speakers to talk about. And so we want to help, again, guide and hold people's hand through the process there to get them on the path to booking, getting booked and paid to speak.
So there's, very likely a subsegment of our audience that's saying, I don't really want to be paid as a speaker. It's 2022. Well, I'm doing all of my work remotely and on Slack and an email. Why is kind of the art of speaking so important still today, even for somebody that's not going to be on a stage?
Yeah. And I think, again, what's great about speaking is there's certainly people that are would be like my wife, who's going, there's zero chance I will ever get up on stage. Like, that is the most unappealing thing that I can possibly think of. Like, it's just no thanks at all. But whereas for me, I love it. I absolutely love being up there on stage. It's a ton of fun. And so you don't have to be a speaker by any means, but I totally agree with your point, Mike, that being a good communicator is very essential regardless of what you're doing, right? So being able to clearly articulate a point or an idea or a thought or a question or whatever it may be, like, that's really, really important. And so we also live in a society where people who are articulate, who are clear at communication, there's a certain level of authority that we ascribe to those people, and certainly a level of prestige or recognition that we ascribe to them. And so, again, whether or not you want to be a professional speaker, being able to really clearly communicate verbally or via, again, Slack or within an email or blog post or whatever it may be, clearly communicating your ideas and getting a message across to other people in whatever capacity is a really, really vital skill.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like a way to stand out and kind of cut against the grain, right? The trend is digital, written, short, all of that kind of stuff. And when you can communicate articulately, verbally, or you're just a darn good writer, and especially within business, like if you can kind of have everything right there, all the elements of what's needed that your boss might need, or that the consumer of that information might need, and it's easy to skim through and all of that, like, you set yourself apart. So we talk about that all the time. We have mechanisms in place for written communication and hiring, because it's so vital to our business as a remote team. And then when you talk to somebody who understands how to communicate verbally, it's easy to set apart. So we do a lot of talking to our audience about how do we set ourselves apart. And I think that skill is one, and it's a hard one to tackle, right? I mean, isn't like, aren't people most afraid of public speaking? Like, they're even more afraid of it than death or something like that. Yeah. I forget the exact wording of it, but so that I do think it's elemental and fundamental to anybody that's working in business to be a good communicator. Do you have some tips just off the top of your head in terms of somebody to become a better speaker?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things that I always would recommend. One is to tell a lot of stories. Like, as humans, we're just drawn to stories. And so if I said, let me tell you a quick story, which I've tried to do a couple times here, or illustrations or analogies. So let me tell you about a steakhouse versus a buffet. Let me tell you about, imagine if you had brain surgery. Let me tell you about going to Reno and meeting up with this speaker friend. Let me tell you about my very first gig, and I got handed a check and I, cried like a baby. Like, trying to use stories, because as humans, we are drawn to stories. We connect with stories. So if I said, let me tell you a story, like, most of us, we immediately lean in going like, he's going to tell a story. I don't know where this is going. Is this going to be funny or sad or inspirational? Is this going to be boring or depressing? Is this going to be heroic? I have zero clue, but it's a story. And so I'm in. And so use stories, and especially first person stories that you've lived, your experience. Like, as a speaker, as a communicator, you're a human talking to a collection of other humans. So act like a human. Like, don't be super robotic, but just like tell stories. Like, people love stories and they connect with and relate with stories. Another thing I'd definitely recommend, especially if you want to do more speaking and communicating, is take the time to practice. I think oftentimes we see, great communicators or storytellers or and this isn't true with just speaking, but this is true with anything, whether it comes to sports or athletics or golf or bands or musicians. Sometimes we see someone doing their craft and we think, oh, they're just really, really good at it. And yeah, like there may be a certain skill set that they have that someone else doesn't have. Like LeBron James is a very, very large human being. He's a very strong human being, but he's also like works really, really, really hard at his skill, at his craft of basketball. And so I think sometimes we see someone and we think they're just naturally good. I can never be that good. But also remember that oftentimes when you're looking at someone do something and they're really, really great at it, that everybody starts from zero. Everybody starts from scratch. And so like with a podcast, for example, I host a podcast called the Speaker Lab Podcast. We've done over 400 episodes now on all different subjects and topics speaking. And so my assumption is that episode 400 is better than episode 1. My most recent speaking gig was better than that first gig where I got paid $1,000. And so again, everybody starts from zero. And so you can't always compare yourself to where someone else is when you're just getting going, or you think, oh, I'll never be as good of a speaker. I'll never be as good of a communicator. I'll never be as good as whatever it is that they do. But there was a time where they started from scratch. There are times where they have sucked at that thing that you're trying to accomplish as well. And so also just like not playing this comparison game, but recognize like so much work happens behind the scenes that makes them more comfortable and confident. So by the time they get up on stage, whatever that stage may look like, that they're prepared and ready to go.
Makes a lot of sense. That's great advice. I'm curious from your perspective, like what are some elements of a great speech? On stage, you're in front of 13,000 people. Is there a little bit of a formula? What are some elements? Obviously stories, right? That's one that you've hit on, but what else?
Yeah, I think it's, it's kind of like a movie, for example, meaning that there's no like exact format or formula that you have to follow for a movie. There's going to be certain things that the like themes that you may see from one movie to the next, but sometimes there's a movie where like, a main character dies in the first 10 minutes and you're like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Or maybe that they play the ending at the beginning and then you kind of work backwards to see how you got to that point. And so it's not like you got to do an intro and you got to do 3 points and then you got to do a conclusion, or you got to tell them what you're going to tell them and then tell them what you told them. Like, does that work? Yeah, absolutely. It does work, but it doesn't always have to be some type of cookie cutter formulaic, routine that you do. So, I think that the best speeches are ones that you can remember, that there's something that stands out to you, that they make like one point really, really, really clear, versus it's not uncommon for someone to hear a speaker. And we've both probably experienced this before. You heard a speaker, maybe they were even a good speaker, and you leave and you're just like, I just listened to them for 30 or 45 minutes. I couldn't tell you what they talked about. Or it's just, you're kind of like fumbling for some words, trying to put something together, but be really, really clear on like, hey, here's, the main idea that I want to drill home, have use stories or ways that people can remember it. Cause even like, again, everything we've talked about here, the reality is a lot of people won't remember everything that we've talked about, but you may remember that steakhouse buffet analogy. You may remember the challenge exceeding the skill set and the story behind that, and being at Lake Tahoe to talking about that conversation. Like, we remember stories, and so what is it that makes it sticky and memorable from what it is that you covered? So I think like doing some of those things, but also not being like stuck into a formula of, here's the way that I was taught in speech class in high school or college, and therefore that's the way I have to give a presentation. There's not. Like, do it in a way that resonates and makes sense for you and for the audience. Got it.
Do you have a favorite speech that you've given, or memorable moment being on stage, or favorite story, that's something that sticks out from your time on stage?
Yeah, I mean, part of the fun of speaking is it's a live tightrope, and sometimes you're just like, "Woo, that was fun, that went really well," and sometimes like I fell off the tightrope, and like everyone is different. It's not like if we're recording this podcast and like right now it's just you and I talking. If we really fumbled something, like we can stop the recording or we can edit it out later. But when you're on stage and people are staring at you and you're live and you draw a blank, like you're live, so you gotta make it work. So yeah, there's times where like just crazy weird things have happened. I had a time where a dog came running into the room. I was speaking to, I don't know, probably 500 people or so. Dog comes running in, just zipping all over the room there. And like, nobody's listening to what you have to say. There's a time where I was speaking and I remember this was at a hotel in New Jersey, and they were doing like some construction outside the property, and the power got cut to the entire hotel. And so you're just all suddenly speaking in the dark, and you're like, what do you do now? I remember speaking in Texas several years ago, and I was speaking in Galveston, and there was a hurricane incoming that was supposed to make landfall the next day, and it was a major hurricane. And so you're trying to like give a speech, and nobody's paying attention. Like everybody's looking at their phones and trying to figure out how to get out of town or check on their family or whatever. I'm thinking the same thing. Like, I don't want to be here. I got to get out of town, So like, there's things where you're just like, you get off stage and you're like, dang, that was really good. Like, I just crushed that. And then there's times where you're just like, that sucked. That did not go well at all. Like, again, that's just part of it. That's part of being a speaker. That's part of being an entrepreneur. That's part of life.
Excellent. I want to give you the floor to say anything you want to say to our audience as we wrap up. If we missed something, if I didn't ask a very good question, or you just got something on your mind that you want to talk to our audience about, I'm going to give you the floor.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of things. One is if you're interested in speaking, you want to learn more on that topic. Again, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably listen to other podcasts. So check out the Speaker Lab podcast. Like I said, we've got over 400 episodes there on everything and anything related to speaking, marketing, speaking fees, different industries and topics, and lots of different stuff there. So definitely check out the Speaker Lab podcast. Also, we got a book called The Successful Speaker. Let me grab a copy here. 5 steps for booking gigs, getting paid, and building your platform. So it walks through the roadmap that we teach on how to exactly you find and book gigs. So definitely check that out. And then it's just kind of like an overarching thought or idea here. One thing I speak on from time to time, and I tell our team regularly, is that who you are is more important than what you do. Who you are is more important than what you do. Meaning, Mike, if you and I are great podcasters, we're great speakers, we're great entrepreneurs, if we're great at what we do, but we drop the ball as husbands, as dads, as moms, as wives, as human beings, if we are a shell of a human being, we are doing it wrong. And so I love being an entrepreneur. I love speaking. I love podcasting. I love everything we've covered and talked about today. But my most important roles are being a good husband and being a good father. If I screw up those 2 things, then everything else has been screwed up. But if I get those 2 things right, then nothing else matters. So those are the roles that really, really matter. So who you are is more important than what you do.
Fantastic advice. That I resonate with that. That's been the driving force in terms of how I've intentionally set up my life to be able to be around, do well at work, but be close, be around, and try to teach my kids and the 3 boys that I have, how to do things the right way and show up and kind of do it all. And I think you have to think about it from that holistic standpoint, and then take action steps and be intentional about how you set up your life. So I appreciate that. I love the sentiment. Where can people find you on the internet? We talked about Speaker Lab. We talked about the podcast. But any other spots people can find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, I mean, everything we do related to speaking is over at thespeakerlab.com, thespeakerlab.com. I'm on social media. I think on Instagram at G Baldwin, Twitter, Grant Baldwin, but I don't really do anything on those, to be honest with you. So yeah, the simplest place to catch me is over at thespeakerlab.com. Okay, perfect. We'll have links to all of those in our show notes page. This has been fantastic, Grant. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here, and have an awesome rest of your week. Mike, thanks, man. I appreciate it. All right. Take care.